So, hello, Anke, and welcome to the show. I am so looking forward to chatting today after recently finishing your new book, Cult Trip. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Oh, kia ora, Casey. Kia ora is hello from New Zealand, where I live. I'm a journalist. I'm a foreign correspondent. I'm originally from Germany. This is my fourth book, but maybe the most impactful one, which was just released as an international bestseller paperback in the UK this year and last year in New Zealand.
That is a wonderful introduction. Absolutely amazing. Journalism is something that I personally find really interesting and sometimes get asked, "Are you a journalist?" And I say, "I don't think so," although sometimes maybe a little bit, and I'm not really too sure. Is journalism something you always felt drawn towards, or is it a position that you accidentally fell into?
I've done journalism actually since my last year at school. So I've been doing it for over 30 years. Was curious about people, didn't want to go to university at the time. So I did an internship that turned into a media apprenticeship in Los Angeles for a foreign correspondent there. And interestingly enough, it's also where I think I had my first, I'm not cult experience, but at least I brushed, against a cult there, which was Scientology, because they were all over the show. So I've already been freelancing since I left school, and then started with a newspaper in Cologne, my hometown back in Germany, and then moved into magazines, and later I did a lot of celebrity journalism, very different to what I'm doing now, actually. Worked for TV, and then later when I moved to New Zealand with my family, about 20 years ago, actually, I started working here as a foreign correspondent. But the cult journalism, if that's what you mean, that's sort of, I fell into that more accidentally. That wasn't anything I'd ever planned, that I would end up writing a book about it and doing so much research about it. Yeah.
What is the role of a foreign correspondent? Because I feel like it sounds like the type of like a consulate, but I don't feel like that's the same sort of thing. Like people that are dotted around in different people's countries, like, oh, I need to go and see like the UK representative over here in Norway kind of thing. Like, how does it all work?
I mean, it's not completely wrong when you say dotted around the country. So I'm a freelance foreign correspondent or freelance correspondent for the German media. So as a foreign correspondent, you live in the country. I mean, not everyone lives in the country. A lot of people like Christian Annenpour just, are being parachuted in, so to speak. But I actually live in the country that I report about and write about. So I report back for the German media about things that happen here, like big news, like the mosque shooting in 2019 or the Christchurch earthquakes, which I actually lived through myself. So I was quite personally affected, but also like everyday, more like background stories, social issues. I have a regular column for a German newspaper. I do big features. So yeah, it's actually a great job. It's like any other journalism, but your readership is 18,000 kilometers away in my case. Yeah.
That sounds so good. And then, like, there's always loads of different things happening, so you're not always stuck in the same type of storytelling. And I imagine that it helps to keep things fresh. And I imagine you may have even felt a little bit smug reporting over to Germany that there weren't any COVID cases where you were living at one point. I think you might be the
Yeah.
only place in the world.
Yeah, we had it. I mean, we had it pretty good actually during the pandemic. I have to say, at least those Kiwis who were stuck here or who live here, the ones that couldn't get back, not so great for them, because they're now having a closed border, which was absolutely the right thing to do at the time, and really, really saved us, from so much that you in the UK and other countries had to suffer through. Yeah, but it had the flip side also, that some people couldn't come back. But overall, I'm just really, really grateful that we, had Jacinda Ardern as our prime minister, and her really sensible approach to COVID, and her, it was, yeah, I don't know, feeling proud is probably not the right word, but I'm grateful, that I was here and not some other places in the world where that wasn't possible. Yeah.
When I was reading Cult Trip, it felt very refreshing and insightful as a investigative journalistic piece that was slightly memoiristic and had elements of other people's stories and experiences and testimonies, but with your narrative and your personal thoughts and feelings tying the book together. And different to other investigative journalistic books about cults that I've read, it is made up of several different groups and experiences that you've dived into, which I really appreciated. It was like an anthology of different groups tied together with your own perspective. And you didn't hold back on how you felt as the narrator as well, which gave the book another layer of insight into how these groups affect people, not only as the events unfold, but really how people are impacted decades after these things have happened. And it's an incredible book. I highly recommend everybody pick up a copy of Cult Trip.
Wow,
What?
thank you so much. That really, you've just summed it up beautifully. I feel really seen. I want to copy that. I want to copy that and put it as a blurb on the back.
That would be great.
Really.
I'll send you the type up later. How far into your journalism were you when you had a chance encounter in Byron Bay in Australia?
So that was 10 years ago. So I was already well over 20 years into my journalism. So I wasn't a rookie. I wasn't a newcomer. I've done a lot, and I hadn't planned at that time to write anything about cults. I had already written 3 books. They've all been published in Germany, new nonfiction books. And then I went to this New Age festival in Byron Bay. It's still going. I'm actually going back to Byron Bay later this year, not to the same festival though. And I met a woman there from a former sex and therapy cult called Centrepoint here in New Zealand. And she was also from New Zealand. So someone introduced us and we talked, and I was quite fascinated. I mean, I was fascinated with everything at this festival. First, I was really, really skeptical because I'm not very esoteric or New Age. And, I always, I don't know, I had my preconceptions, let's put it that way, prejudices about the neo-tantra scene. And I went there because some friends went, and I went along, and I was curious. And also I had I had pitched this to a magazine to write about, anonymously, mind you, under pseudonym. I wasn't brave enough to put my name to a story about, a festival with lots of sort of sexy massage workshops and deep breaths, release your inner orgasm, kundalini energy, all these things. I thought, oh no, that's a bit cringy, but I still want to go there. I want to write about it, but maybe not under my name. And then I met Anke there, Anke Mikkel-John, and she told me pretty early on that she had grown up in a kind of sex cult. And I thought, oh, wow, where? In New Zealand? Yeah, she said Centrepoint. I had never even heard about it at that time. And then I met her again a few months later. And in the meantime, Bert Potter, the guru, the founder of that community, had died. And maybe that also, suddenly he was in the news, and I became more aware of, oh, that's what Centrepoint was. Oh, and Angie was part of that. And then I met her again, and I had the idea I said, look, why? It's weird, no one's written a book about Centrepoint, because there was a similar community at the same time at the other end of the world where I come from. We're not in Germany, but in Austria, and lots of Germans were involved, and that was the Otto Mühl commune. And they were notorious for their extremely enforced I wouldn't even say polyamory, but anti-monogamy, it's maybe the right word, and promiscuity, and just sort of tribal living. And I mean, I was really familiar with them, and it was always fascinating. I thought, hang on, this is a similar thing here in New Zealand. Why has no one written a book about it? And I kind of naively thought I could just do this, and I actually got a publisher, a really good publisher, and a contract, and Angie wanted to tell her story, and that's how it all started. So I actually started off with a book that I never finished in the end, but we can talk about that later, why it all fell over. But this is how I was sucked into cult journalism.
It sounds as if there was the potential for maybe 20 different books to be written about this one festival and all of its intrinsic elements, because if you were to really explore all of the corners of a new age festival, I can only begin to imagine that there was so many different things that you could have, so many different rabbit holes. Like, what is kundalini energy, where does it come from, and what groups use it as influence today? Even that on its own is like a whole thing. And so many parts of your book talking about the power of orgasm. Of course, I was thinking of One Taste, and there's a lot talked about with One Taste in Cult Trip as well. And I wasn't aware that there were other groups that basically use exactly the same teachings and rhetoric. So it's all just copied from the same playbook. So that's what's really interesting about Cult Trip as well. There's other things just kind of thrown in, peppered in throughout. And even though the focus might be we're talking about Centerpoint, there's also other things that are mentioned. And if you are somebody that is interested in the subject of cults, you'll recognize different words, groups, and terminologies, and you're almost like, oh, and that's awesome.
Yeah, you see the patterns, right? You pick up patterns, yeah. And it took me a while to pick up the pattern because I didn't go to that festival because I knew a lot about cults or these kind of groups. You know, I knew quite a bit about Scientology. I read lots of books about them, and I was more familiar with those kind of 70s, 80s, 90s psycho cults. But going to this festival didn't actually seem culty to me. Something really there, something there really hooked me in. I had my sort of blissful awakening after a session of ecstatic dance, and something. I dropped my cynicism, and something clicked. And I think I had my blinkers on straight from the beginning that the scene that I was moving in could have culty elements. While I was, with my professional hat on, I was really interested in this former, sex cult teenager, Angie, who told me she'd been the concubine of the commune. And so I was drawn to her story professionally. And maybe, I mean, don't need to, psychoanalyze myself, but if I would do that, I would think, well, maybe because something was pulling me already in the direction of this new group and this new movement for very personal reasons, not with a critical sort of cult lens on. Maybe that's also the reason why I was fascinated by Centerpoint, because I thought, well, hang on, these people back then, or what they wanted, or why they went into all these new age or human potential therapy workshops, and why they opened up their relationships, and why they wanted to live communally. Maybe they weren't actually that different from the kind of people who I was hanging out with at that festival. And therefore I wanted to, I guess, to unpack and get behind why did this big utopian dream turn in such a collective nightmare. So there was always a bit more. I had skin in the game, so to speak. Yeah, there was always a bit more than just, oh, this is a good story, I'm a journalist, let's investigate that. I had some deeper personal interest that maybe I wasn't even really aware of at the time.
I wonder what it looks like for a journalist with a book deal who's going to jump into the subject of Centerpoint with Angie as kind of, I suppose, at the start, the center of the story, and what surrounds Angie as an individual, and then realizing that it was a monster that you were kind of walking straight into the mouth of the jaws of the beast. Can you talk the listeners through what it looks like to prepare for an investigation? Do you have an idea of a plan and how you gather resources? Or is it just you go to Angie and Angie says, oh, you might be interested in speaking to so-and-so, or gives you a list of names and you try to track them down? I just would not have any idea how to start. And I'm really interested in learning about how you do that in your own mind.
Well, it's a little bit more complex than I mean, ideally, I would have just gone to Angie. She would have told me her story. That's what I thought we should do. We go, I write it all down. She gets to read it all. I sprinkle in some facts about Centerpoint, and her personal story is the book. Yeah. And just after I was signed up by my publisher, another book came out. Actually, the first book about Centerpoint came out, written by a victim as well, a teenager who'd been sexually abused there in one of the drug experiments they did at Centerpoint. They took MDMA together with teenagers, She had been one of them, and her book came out, and it was just a slim book. It could have been edited better, but for me, it was like, oh gosh, there is actually a book now out, a victim story. What am I doing telling Ange's story? And my publisher said, no, keep going, just make it bigger, just make it wider, just find more people. And a few months into it all, the editor at my publishing house, quit. I was completely on my own, and the investigation suddenly got so much wider. So like you said, exactly like how it was, I started off with Angie, and then it was Angie who said, you should speak to so-and-so and so-and-so. And then I found someone gave me a book that had been written about Centrepoint, the only other book before everything fell over, that had been written in the 1980s. And it was actually a piece of PR, really, to maybe whitewash them a bit, because there were all the allegations about the sexual abuse of children. Just to put that out for those who are not familiar with Centrepoint, it ended up being a massive sex abuse scandal. And 1/3 of the children at Centrepoint had been potentially sexually abused, and 10 or more people actually were arrested and went to jail for their sexual abuse and for manufacturing drugs. So, just to put that out, that is what Centrepoint in New Zealand is mostly known for, unfortunately. And of course, it was also a home for many, many people. So that in itself is complex. So I started off finding my way into this labyrinth. And one of the first people I got in touch with was the author of that book, Inside Centrepoint. And he had actually lied for Bert Potter in court when it came to the drugs, and said, oh, they were just placebos. So they all had this party line from Centrepoint court that they all lied for Bert, for the guru, and said, they never manufactured drugs. These were just placebos to do some studies on how people come up on drugs if they're not drugs, whatever. He lied, and he fled the country, went to Australia. He's actually a retired therapist there now. And I tracked him down, and he said he's never spoken to a journalist from New Zealand because they're all prejudiced, and he doesn't trust the New Zealand media. But he spoke to me because I'm originally from Germany. So that was a massive door opener. I flew over to Melbourne, visited him, and it's hard to say whether he was trying to play me. I think to some degree he was, but he also gave me his unpublished manuscript of his Years with Bert Potter, which was it's almost like, wow, I struck gold right from the get-go. And then doors kept opening because he also introduced me to some of the people from his faction. So Centrepoint fell over. It was shut down 23 years ago when the trust was, the Centrepoint Trust was transformed, and the last people basically had to leave there. But the raids and everything, the drug raids, the arrests, all that happened in the mid-90s. So this also when a lot of people left. So just, do the math. It's been a long, long time since everything fell over, and it has never really been addressed. And here I am all these years later, decades later, poking around, the outsider, knocking at people's doors, tracking them down, thinking, not naively, but thinking, oh, maybe, finally they can talk about this. And I lifted the lid off of some really big trauma, and a lot of people freaked, and a lot of people weren't happy to talk. And then and there are all these factions now. There were already factions back then at Centrepoint, but now over all these years, people are so entrenched in their own narratives. And there are a couple of different narratives. One narrative, for instance, is that these young girls, these teenagers, the frisky teenagers from Centrepoint, who seemed so, so sexual and were treated like women, and they could have whatever they wanted. Well, a lot of them choose to be sexual with much older men as a survival strategy. Yeah, a 12-year-old being the quote unquote mistress of the 60-year-old guru, that was absolutely her survival strategy, and she took him to court later. So the narrative of the Bert followers was always, these girls wanted this, they said yes, they had a choice. It was only the social workers and the police who turned them, who turned a beautiful thing into something criminal later on. Yeah, we had the free love commune here, we were liberating everyone, and it's only the outside society who got it wrong. And these things happen everywhere, and stop pointing the finger at Centrepoint. And that narrative still runs till today, even with the second generation. Yeah, for instance, some of the children of the main guru and the perpetrators have the same narrative, and it's maybe some form of self-preservation, or being able to still love their family if they stay in that camp. But these camps, some of them are not, they're definitely not talking to each other. Then you have the victims who took perpetrators to court, people went to jail. So there's been this massive legal reckoning at some stage a long time ago. And since then, there has been no form of closure, or the German word that we have, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means basically coming to terms with the past, which is a term that applies to how Germans had to deal with their World War II history, and facing it and being honest about it and making repairs and somehow, redeem themselves. And that never happened with Centerpoint. So that was the territory I was moving in, Casey, all these years later. And doors closed to me, doors opened. I went down so many labyrinths and corridors and opened doors, and there were cesspools behind them. Not always was their goal. So that became my investigation, and it was huge. Plus, I had hundreds and hundreds of pages of court files. I had unpublished memoirs, not just the one, others as well. I didn't exactly have a murder war, but I kind of had a murder war on paper, around me. I had diagrams of who was connected to whom. I had the database of all the old Centerpoint magazines. So that in itself, you find all these names and all these photos, and then you try and find them, these people today, through social media. But it's always tricky because you don't know you get an idea who they were back then. Okay, they were in that leading role, or they were running workshops, or where they were the children of a perpetrator. But then you don't know 20 years later, when you find them somewhere, how do you approach them? Do they hate Centerpoint? Do they not, are they happy a journalist comes and finally exposes more of it? Or do they freak and don't want their darkest secret to be revealed, that they live there? Or are they defensive of it? I never know. I never knew, and I made a few mistakes in the beginning where I was so outspoken or too clear in my emails, where I actually used words like, sex crimes or so much. I mean, people went to jail for these crimes. They're actually on the record. They were, this is, I didn't make this up. People went in court. But even that got big reaction from people who then didn't want to talk to me because I used that word, and then I'm clearly biased and I don't understand what it really was. So I was constantly juggling this. It was a minefield I was moving in for about 2 years. Yeah.
When you were writing Cult Trip, or when you were investigating Centerpoint, there were times where you talked about all of this material that you'd been given for your investigation to piece everything together, and there were boxes and books and tapes and diaries and testimonies and all of these interviews that you'd done with all of these different people. What has happened to all of that stuff? Do you still have it in a few boxes in your shed? Just
I'm just leaning down to see if the box is still under my desk over there, and I think I've actually finally moved the big Centerpoint box into the attic, because when my book, the first book, the Centerpoint book, is actually not the book that's come out now, because I had to stop that after 2 years. I actually had to stop. It was too much, but I can talk about that later. But that box has finally gone up to the attic when the legalizing for culture was done, when everything was ticked off, when I knew, okay, this is the book's going into print. I can't change anything anymore, unless someone comes and wants to sue me or so. Then I probably have to pull that box out again and prove that, these are the transcripts of my interviews, and those are the old articles where I found all this in the archives. But no, the box is on the attic where I think it belongs. But yeah, it is a lot of material that I have there.
It reminded me a lot about an individual who was at Centerpoint, who I only know of because of the New Zealand media outlet Stuff. They did a podcast with Adam Dudding called The Commune. And when I was listening to Barry tell her story about how she was the person that kept all the information about Centerpoint, wrote the Centerpoint magazine, put everything together, sent it all out to print, and who has kept all of these physical archives. I mean, I can't imagine how Adam Dudding felt walking into Barry's home and being like, oh my goodness, everything is here. So you talk about Barry in Cult Trip, and it's a really interesting interaction. One of the times that you mention Barry in the book, because a female victim of Centrepoint, a survivor of Centrepoint, who was treated horrifically and had some really awful experiences, sits down with Barry. And I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what that felt like, being present in that very layered and difficult atmosphere, because there were so many moving parts in that one room.
Yes, that was a really significant meeting. So I had sat in Barry's lounge before as well, leaving with stacks and stacks of her materials and her photocopies. And I mean, you were just asking about Adam Dubbing stuff because, yeah, I'm actually wondering what's going to happen with all the material, because I don't know if you know, but Barry died not too long ago, right? Yes, I mean, yeah, it hasn't been very long, and yeah, bless her. I mean, she has helped so many people. She was an incredible person who turned her life around to redeem herself, because she was one of the founding members of Centrepoint. She was she ran the Centrepoint magazine. She did the propaganda for Potter. Yeah, she was a fanatical follower, and then later turned into an angry disbeliever. So because she'd been my main informant, so to speak, she was like an archive for Centrepoint, and also she was a fact checker for me until the very end. I mean, she was already riddled with cancer and almost dying, and she was still answering emails when I had a question, and amazing woman. So I trusted her completely. I knew where she stood. I knew she's very, very reliable, and I also knew that her relationship with her own daughters, or at least some of them, was very severe because of what happened, because she took them to Centrepoint, because they didn't make that choice, but she did, and they were angry still at her for what had happened there. And I don't know all the ins and outs. She could never really go there with me because she had to promise her daughters that she would keep that private, and I want to respect that. But I think that's also, it's one of the layers we just talked about. One of those layers is also that she, to some degree, had lost her daughters. Not all of them, but it was difficult, yeah? And they would not talk to her about Centrepoint. She could not talk to them about Centrepoint. She talked to everyone else about it, to me and other survivors and journalists, but I felt it was a taboo in her own family. And maybe, who knows, maybe that's also what drove her, maybe then to help others even more. So when I met Louise, the girl in the caravan in my book, because she lived on the Centrepoint grounds at 11 years old, she moved there when she was 10, and her sexual abuse started 3 months later after she arrived there. And then she later lived in a caravan alone on the property, because children there were usually separated from their parents, and she barricaded herself with junk in this caravan to stop men from coming to her at night. And her story really was a changing point for me, and moved me really, really deeply, and shocked me, and brought me to tears, and just left me speechless, not even the right word. It left me angry, because I met her quite, I was already a year and a bit into my research, and I'd met a lot of the deniers, and they're very pleasant, older people of Centrepoint who had their act together and their life together, and who could give me their seemingly sort of measured take on it all. And after I met her, it was like, wow, how can you not get it that you were also responsible for this kind of damage, for someone like her not coping in the world and suffering, and because she's had massive anxiety since then. She's single. Her life has been so affected by what happened to her. So when I met her, and then maybe that's not a great thing either. Maybe I had a bit of a rescue on me, or the lines were already blurred at this stage. I was on a bit of a mission. I wasn't just always, of course, you always try to be objective as a journalist, but you also yourself. And in order to build this trust and come close to someone like her, and her to trust me, we had to, I'm compassionate, and so I was right in there with her, and I think something really changed from then on. And it was a bit of a slippery slope, because I stepped out of this purely professional role. At the same time, though, I was writing a book, and I wasn't reporting about Centrepoint for a newspaper. So I think if I'd been in a in a clear media role, I probably wouldn't have done what I did then. But because I thought, well, this is my book, I can basically do whatever I want. And if I want to experience something here with this survivor, then it's not like there's a media law against that. So I just thought I'd just do the right thing. And I bring her together with Barry, Leslie. And she was really open to that. And so, yeah, basically like a lost mother and a lost daughter, because Louise, the girl in the caravan, her mum had died a long time ago, and she was very, very alone. And I know that she has never had an apology from anyone from Centerpoint, apart from the former commune doctor, who actually wrote a letter to her later in life, full of guilt and remorse. And that was a heartfelt letter. And she always had that. And I've seen the letter because it was in a stack of poems and court files and photocopies and things that I got from her. So I brought Barry and her together. And yeah, I'm probably not going to go through it minute by minute now, otherwise it's going to take very long. It is in my book, but the nuance or the surprising thing for me was that at first they were very, very nice to each other, interested in each other. And clearly Louise wanted to get something from Barry. She wanted to finally, I think, see someone showing some remorse or acknowledging what had happened to her. And what she got instead was a lot of explanation about why things were the way they were, and why, the adults didn't really know, and they were all under pressure from Bert. And it was kind of excruciating to watch, because I could see that, if Barry had only been able to actually say, I am so, so sorry, it would have made a big difference. And then when Louise finally left, Barry tried to help her. She gave her a list of therapists, and she said, I'm in your team. I'm here to help. But I think the emotional move that she could have made that would have really made a difference, she wasn't really able to do that. And I still don't know until today why, what it was. And she later told me she's said so many apologies to her children, and she's been awake every night thinking she should kill herself because of her guilt. So her explanation to me was, all this guilt doesn't help. She's been there, she's done that. It doesn't help. She's here to inform people so that this doesn't happen again. And I get that. At the same time, I thought, yeah, but with this person in front of you, yeah. So it's really complex. And then it showed me a lot about these different layers, these different factions, the expectations, the hurt, the unresolved trauma, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of accountability, all of that. It was all there in that room.
The parts of Cult Trip that really resonated with me personally as a reader were the parts where you spoke within these experiences and gathering these testimonies, and how it was affecting you personally, collecting all of this information. And a part of your book, a part of Cult Trip that I read, says, my reaction to Louise's pain is another sign that I've come too close. My research feels like it's turning into a moral crusade. I'm on a slippery slope, and not just professionally. Instead of talking to Louise, I should be seeing a therapist. And that was like a ton of bricks on me when I read that. It is so tough to stay neutral and objective and not get angry and frustrated on behalf of the individuals that we speak to about these experiences. And I wonder now, if that is the reason you had to stop writing the book, how do you come to that decision? It must be extremely difficult to put in hundreds of hours of work to have people tell you their deepest, most harrowing experiences, and then also have to say, well, I'm sorry, I need to do this for myself, but I also now can't help you tell your story the way you wanted it to be told. There's, again, so many layers and levels, and I wondered if you could just talk us through how you navigate that.
Look, there's a bit more of a backstory than what I wanted to put in the book, because the most, I didn't want to take away from the story of the victims and survivors. Their pain surmounts, the pain I felt having to talk to them about it. Yeah, and you're right. It is vicarious trauma, but at the same time, I wanted to give their trauma and what I can tell through that more space. So, but I can tell you a bit more now. Okay, so what happened was sheer overwhelm, and that I didn't have a person who was guiding me. I didn't have a boss. At my news outlets, you have an editor, you have an editor-in-chief, or you have a newsroom, you have colleagues. If you write for a book, you have your editor in the publishing house. I didn't have that because that person had left 4 months into it all. And when the project became more and more complicated, and I thought, okay, I really need to speak to someone from Allen & Unwin, especially maybe the legal department or so, just to get some guidance, because there's so many conflicting things, and I just don't know how to really, make sure that I can put all this in the book, and don't have to take half of it out later, and just to get some guidance here. I was out of my league, felt out of my depth. They pretty much fought me off and told me, because they all went back to Sydney then. The person who signed me up was from New Zealand. Anyway, long backstory. They weren't very supportive. I think they were getting cold feet actually at this stage, because they were getting legal threats as well from some of the people who weren't happy with what I was doing. So they probably thought, oh, this book is going to cost us a lot in legal fees. And they just wanted me to finish it and not make a fuss, and not make it complicated. But it was complicated. It wasn't as straightforward and easy as that. And so I was already dealing with all these conflicts and contradictions and the legal issues, and had no one really to go to, apart from one amazing freelance investigative journalist here in New Zealand who became my mentor, and I could run a few things past him, but he could not relieve me of that emotional burden. And you've just, I think you've described it really well, this feeling. I didn't even really realize at the time what it was, because I had no training in that. I've been a journalist. I was a journalist already at that stage for over 20 years, and I've done all sorts of interesting, fascinating stories and interviews with celebrities and investigative, big stuff. But I'd never come that close to trauma victims, especially not around sexual abuse. And I had no training of any sorts about that, and what it actually means and what it can do to you with, and that I had no supervision, like maybe if a policewoman has when she interviews someone for the first time, or how therapists have it. So in some ways I was in a similar role, hearing people like Louise, the girl in the caravan. I was the first person she ever told her horrific story to in her mid-40s. She'd never even spoken to a therapist, even though she'd taken people to court, but she'd only written it all down for the court. So, I took on a lot that I just didn't know what to do with it. And then a dear friend of mine died here in Christchurch in a car crash with her little girl and another kid in the car. So it was a massive trauma that I went through, or grief. I was just floored by grief. Stopped in my tracks, stopped my whole research for about 2 months or so. And it was almost a relief at the time that I could just stop everything. So, it sounds awful, but I do remember really well the day when she died, and I was actually just off to another round of interviews in Auckland, and this call came in the morning. Her friend had died, and amongst this immense pain and shock and the horror of it all, sending an email out to these people I'd lined up for my next interviews, when it would be difficult and they might pull back, and they were all the difficult ones, the deniers and the enablers, and one woman who'd gone to jail, actually. Just sending an email, say, look, sorry, we can't do this interview. A friend of mine's died. I will come back to you at some stage. It was such a relief, actually. That should have told me something, right? And then a few months later, when I was ready to pick things up again, I was almost a bit cynical at that stage when someone, said trauma. And I thought, you guys don't even know what real trauma is. My friend, the husband of the dead, friend, he survived the car crash, and half of his family is gone. And yeah. So anyway, this is just a bit of a backstory that's not in the book, but this is also what I was going through. I was just finding it all way, way, way too hard. And then because of the delay of the grief and just the pure accumulation of material and court cases and contradictions, I asked my publisher to push the deadline out for another half year, because my deadline was coming up. And they said, no, sorry, we can't, which I think was just to get an out clause for them, actually, because they probably got cold feet at this stage. So I paused everything. I stopped everything. And I thought it was just going to be a pause. I actually went on a silent meditation retreat for a week to just, come to an answer. And then when I came out of that at the end of that year, I was always, okay, I've just hit the pause button. We'll see what I'll do with it. And the longer the pause lasted, the longer it was clear I can't go back to it. It's been so detrimental to my own mental health. And like you said before, Hazy, I felt like I was really letting some people down, especially Louise. They've given, I spent so much time with them. They had such high hopes, her and Angie, but especially Louise had such high hopes with this book. What a change it would bring, that people would actually hear their stories, that it would help to stop sexual abuse of children and communities and so on. And then I could only write the making of it was still a long form journalism, it was still a long form feature here for a really prestigious magazine. It was actually nominated for a media award later, but to me, it really felt like a massive failure that I'd set out to do this big work and I failed and I couldn't do it, and I couldn't do these people justice who trusted me and given me so much of their, innermost personal experiences. Yeah, it was really big. And looking back, I think, wow, yeah, that was that. The making of the book that was never written in the end. But then there was a second round a few years later, and this is why we read Patrick, because at least some of that manuscript that I had back then actually then made it into the new book, and maybe all for the better. Who knows? Yeah.
The other part of the center point section of Cult Trip that really spoke to me as an individual was the almost the cognitive dissonance that you experienced around interviewing individuals that were apologists or deniers or defenders of Centrepoint, complicit in the child abuse, in the sexual abuse of children and young adults, the most vulnerable of individuals that found their way to Centrepoint or were placed there because their parents joined. It's almost like you allow us to see the cogs turning in your mind when you're like, okay, let's think about the times, let's think about let's think about the way things were back then. And then it's like, okay, all right, but that's not a good enough reason for these things to have happened. There's no reason why these things should have ever happened. And then there's the other side of you that's like thinking about the isolation and the coercion and how some people were asking to participate in sexual intercourse with adults. But then again, you go back to, but that's still not ever going to be an answer that's acceptable. How are you now, after these years and years of specifically researching cults and doing work in this space? How are you now with balancing this particular conundrum?
You mean the conundrum of how it can rub off on you and mess with your head, or the conundrum of trying to see it from all sides, which is part of the other conundrum, right? Yes, I think this is actually, looking back, I think this is why it was so conflicting for me, because the other cults that I researched, especially the last one, Gloriavel, this fundamentalist Christian cult in New Zealand, I was never torn really between, I can see it from, both sides. It was just more black and white for me. I just could not get on board at all with the whole community, with who they are. I just basically saw everyone in there as a victim, and I still do, yeah. And I just can't identify with the leaders or anyone, wanting to be in there. With Centrepoint, it was so conflicting because, like what I said in the beginning, maybe because I was drifting into a bit of a, sexual liberal self-exploration scene myself, and also because they were Centrepoint. It wasn't just Centrepoint at the time, even parts of the German Greens and the alternative movement of the 80s, they had some of these similar sort of liberal sounding, but actually very warped ideas that are now very, very outdated, and about sexually free children. And they showed me, it's some of the Centrepoint deniers who were apologists, enablers, who were, therapists there, and still have the narrative that it's actually society that's the baddie, and they were the goodies, if only people would have let them be. They came up with, they showed me studies and whatnot of tribes in the South Pacific or Melanesia where boys are sexually initiated by their uncles, and only, and they were totally fine. It's only when anthropologists come, all these things were in this field. I was constantly, it's almost like I sometimes actually had to question myself, am I getting something wrong here? Am I too conditioned to think in one way? And this is my paradigm that I grew up in, and where, this is right and this is wrong. I had to question that sometimes. And it was really, really disturbing. Because almost like when you spend too much time with these people, it's almost like, you start questioning yourself. Maybe I got it all wrong. Maybe I am on a, moral crusade here that's not really doing them justice, and I'm just getting one end of the stick. And I remember at that time also speaking to quite a well-known Jeffrey Mason, quite a well-known writer anyway, from the States. He was very interested in what I was doing, my work, because he's also a psychotherapist and so on. And I remember once going to him as a bit of a mentor and talking things through with him, because he knew the whole scene from Esalen in California and the human potential movement. And I remember going to him and saying, "Oh, it's not really, it's just not black and white. There's just a massive gray zone." And he said, "No, I don't see a gray zone. I see a massive black spider with some little white dots in between." And I never forgot that he said that. It's always stuck with me, that there is just so much darkness, and it's so, depending on where you stand, there's so much so off-putting. But then again, I want to have this compassion, and I still do. I want to have the compassion, at least the understanding for why people did what they did. And I always had to ask myself, who would I have been in there? Yeah, would I have been the whistleblower? Would I have been the bystander? Would I have been the mother who tries to protect her children from the worst in there, but doesn't have the means or the guts to actually pack up and leave? Because 10 years earlier, I told everyone this is the thing I need to do, and this is the best place. And so you kind of have to stick with your own narrative, otherwise, the cognitive dissonance. So I could always empathize with all these different aspects. So to answer your question, how did I manage to be okay now, which I am, is because when another publisher, after all these years, I had totally borrowed the Centerpoint book. Two documentaries actually came out of my magazine story and a project, and so it wasn't all wasted. But eventually, I kept on doing other cult stories, and eventually HarperCollins asked me if I wanted to write a book about cults, and I already had a lot of material and updated it and pulled it all together. And at that stage, I already knew I need better. I can only do this again if I have really good support, if I go and see a therapist, if I have a team, basically, of friends and colleagues. I had my little chat group on WhatsApp. I actually didn't need them as much as I thought, but they were there. So I made sure I had the right support. I would take enough breaks. And also the most traumatic, the worst interviewing, the most horrific content, that was all basically already investigated and done. I just had to pull it up again and go over it again now with Angie and Louise and others. And luckily they were willing to do that and gave me a second chance after, let them down once. So it was actually psychologically, emotionally not as taxing, nowhere near as difficult as it was the first time, when I just fell into, didn't know, what I was getting myself into, and then ended up with vicarious trauma and overwhelm. This time I was more prepared and more professional, and I was more distant. I basically did what you do as a journalist, and you keep a bit of distance. And so far so good. I made it.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about, by the time you arrive at Gloria Vale, you're kind of like, okay, I see it this way, and that's the way I see it. And I think that shows tremendous growth and experience that you've had over the number of years that you've spent within these environments. It's strange to think about Centerpoint and individuals that perhaps showed up to experience intentional communities and were then subjected to Bert Potter's skewed ideas of how we should be sexually liberal and what that entails from his disgusting perspectives. And the way that I speak about Bert Potter, I think, tells everybody how I can't really be objective. And then also how Bert Potter almost was trying to find anything he could academically that would justify the perversions that he had and that he inflicted on other people. And that included things like, as you mentioned, he visited himself the Esalen Institute in California. And then there was Larry Constantine's book that you mentioned in Cult Trip, titled Children and Sex, New Findings, New Perspectives in 1981, which was hugely used across Centerpoint to justify how having sex with children is good for them. And it's just the weirdest, most backwards research. And nobody really knows what the outcome of those practices are until decades later, when the victims of those practices are coming forward to say, this is how we've been affected horrifically. Like, we have come to points in our lives where we don't want to be alive anymore. Much like we've had the findings of how it affects children when they're physically beaten as punishment, and that's why we're not allowed to do that anymore. Parents aren't allowed to harm their children as a form of punishment.
I mean, they were basically lab rats in a human experiment in some ways, right? They were used in a human experiment with horrific outcomes. And you know this also from other groups. So the rate of suicide, of prostitution, of drug abuse, of mental health problems years later, whether it's from the sannyasin communities or Children of God or Centerpoint, especially those types of communities where so-called sexual freedom was forced on the kids. A lot of them turned asexual. I met a few of them, not surprisingly, boys as well. So, and also let's not forget, boys were also sexually abused at Centerpoint. That's still a bit of an untold story, by the way. The predatory women, and also I met someone who's not in my book. Maybe one day I can write a story about him, but he had a massive breakdown just before the pandemic, not that long ago, and went off the rails with drugs and sex addiction. And until then, he had held on to the narrative that his mum, one of the leading therapists there who'd been in jail, that she, that everything was fine. Whereas in fact, he had been sexually abused by another woman there, and the mother wasn't in. I mean, it's so complex. Those stories decades later still affect people. And yeah, I can't stress enough how big the carnage is, especially for those who didn't choose to go there. It's adults were damaged there too, as they are in every cult, but at least you could say they had at least a choice before. The children didn't. They had a, I mean, I could.
It was interesting to mention the Esalen Institute where
Yeah.
Bert Potter went to stay. I always say that place, I know that there may be some great things that have come out of there, but the Esalen Institute has a lot to answer for.
I went there last year. I was there last year.
Did you go? How did you find it?
I did. And I actually wrote, exactly with my cult glasses on, I actually wrote a big story for North and South magazine here in New Zealand, the one where I also published my first Centerpoint story. How did I find it? Well, this is so complex. I actually really liked it. And I'm also really aware of their history. I mean, so are they, to be fair. Yeah, I think they've come a long way to make sure, to change. So my cult alarm bells were actually not ringing when I was there. And if you look at their history, they have a lot to answer for. They were the birthplace of not just Bert Potter, but a few other cult leaders, like Werner Erhard and others. And the misogyny and the sexual abuse there, and the people who died, who went into psychosis or jumped off the cliffs or killed themselves because they were psychonauts and took too many psychedelics. I mean, they were explorers and pioneers, and they came with a death toll, right? So definitely a very fascinating, interesting history. But my sense was, and I didn't do a deep dive sort of investigation, I just looked at the history, and then I had my own experience there for a week. And my overall sense was that they're on a good track, and they're doing good things, and they're aware, and they're trying to be more diverse, and they're sort of doing the work to not be a culty place. But I know it's a bit of a touchy subject to go there as a cult journalist. I was certainly, don't know if they were so happy to have someone there who had those glasses on.
Your summary is so interesting when you think about how Charles Manson went there one time and they kicked him out because they couldn't get on board with any of his ideas. And then you think like, but you have all of these really like wild out there ideas yourself. And yet Charles Manson shows up and they say, no, you can't stay here.
I mean,
So I'm
if
sure
yeah.
they made it onto his vendetta list along with many other people who were like, "Oh, no, I don't know about you, Mr. Manson."
I mean, Iceland is fascinating because if it's a cult, then it's the Gestalt cult. Yeah, that's what it was known for, because the Gestalt was the dominating mythology, not mythology, but that's sort of their thing, and again, that's all a bit changed, and it's not so dominant anymore, but it was very much, always a place where everything is under the umbrella of Gestalt. And again, it has its pros and cons, and Gestalt in its early days was far more radical and extreme than what we see now, absolutely, respected therapists work with. It's not in itself a dangerous modality, but the way it was, how it all played out in the beginning in those encounter groups. I mean, Esalen is fascinating, and it is the birthplace of the human potential movement. And then Centrepoint was the New Zealand, or the Antipodean appendix of the human potential movement. It was the only place, I think, this part of the world, and it was a heavily inflamed appendix that was ready to burst at some stage. And don't think it's because of the human potential movement as such, or because of Gestalt therapy, or maybe not even because of its promiscuity, or and I just take the sex for children out of that now, but just not even the sexual liberation itself, I think, was the problem, or doesn't need to be the problem. It was the fact that they had a charismatic, narcissistic leader who dominated everything, and he called himself God. So there was the problem right from the start. Yeah.
Another place that Bert Potter went to observe, learn some things, take them back to Centrepoint, which kind of ties us really nicely into the next part of Cult Trip, is the ashram of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in India. So I'm just going to ask you if you can talk the listeners through that whole experience. We saw Frank, your husband, before we hit record, and he makes a few appearances in Cult Trip. So I'm sure that Frank has some of his own stories on things that he's observed and experienced. But please talk us through everything that you have come to learn about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and the Rajneesh movement.
Right. So I grew up in Cologne in Germany, and that was the European headquarters at the time. And I was in my late teens, early 20s. I actually often went and danced in the Bhagwan disco. In Germany they all called him Bhagwan. Now everyone calls him Osho, because he rebranded himself after his big scandal in the States. And I think the rest of the English-speaking world knows him more as Rajneesh. Yeah, it depends. So I was always familiar with the orange people in my neighborhood, in my city, and kind of fascinated and also repulsed. And I was always familiar with, what they stood for, what had gone down in Rajneeshpuram. So it wasn't only through Wild Wild Country that I learned about Osho's Emporium. That was old news for me. And I've always kept a healthy distance from it all, because of the things that we know, and I'm a journalist, and I always saw them as very critical. For me, they were absolutely a cult. And I think it was only here in New Zealand, when I drifted into the neo-tantra scene, at least put my toes in, and met more and more people who I really liked, or they offered fascinating workshops, and then I heard their names, and I saw that they had that connection. And I often had to bring that up then and just question them a little bit, and then I stopped questioning it. I just accepted that some people thought he was great, and they didn't have my upbringing in Germany. They didn't, I almost envied them. They could just be more accepting and maybe naive, and just take the good, whatever this guy had to offer, where I had always had my critical lens on afterwards, when it came to the whole Rajneesh movement. And then my husband and I, we celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary, and wanted to go on a big trip, like a second honeymoon, and went to India. And this idea came up to actually check out his ashram, because we knew that he now, he's dead, he died, but that whatever's left of his cults actually split up in factions as well. As good cults do, they split up in factions when things fall over, right? So one faction still runs the Osho International Meditation Resort. Was it retreat? I think it's resort, yeah. OIMR. And you can check yourself in there. You can book yourself in there and do a week of meditation, or they offer all sorts of programs and primal this and tantra that. Actually, they don't do a lot of tantra anymore. Mystic rows and all these things. So we thought, okay, before we start our backpacking or traveling around India, let's just have a week there and check this out as cult voyeurs some ways, but also knowing the guru is dead, the scandal's been and gone. We didn't feel like we were actually supporting an abusive system at that stage, but we also went there with a kind of skepticism, but also like a sense of adventure. So we checked, we had a week there. We slept in separate rooms. It's almost like a monastery, all very zen, very cold, lots of marble. We had to, on the first day, oh my God, Lacey, I got so rebellious there in no time, because on the first day they put you through all these hours and hours of watching videos and all the rules and all the hygiene, this and the money that, you have to spend so much money there. You have to buy all these gowns in maroon, and then for the night meditation in the big sort of UFO like massive cut like temple, you have to have a white gown. And if you actually get pulled out of the meditation room there, and they tell you off if if you break the rules in any way, you sneeze or so. So it was ridiculous on one level, and it was fascinating on another level. And it is the case with those kind of places. You get used to it after a while. You don't. I was very rebellious in the beginning and thought, oh God, what am I doing here? This is ridiculous. And then I was also curious and fascinated, and I sort of went with the flow and did more and more of their courses and their sessions that they offered, and then the massage and the dancing and whatnot. But I was also actually really relieved to leave there. And I ran into one of the head honchos, and also the infamous former doctor of Osho was also there. He was walking around, and saw him. He's quite famous. And I did an interview also with one of the heads there. And first thing he tells me is, we're the anti-cult. And I thought, wow, since then I've heard this too many times. So it's like an instant red flag for me when you say, oh, this feels a bit culty, and they say, no, we're the anti-cult. Okay, great. That was not the good answer to show me that you understand anything about cults. So it was a fascinating experience, and I would not really want to go back. But people flock there, lots of Westerners, also nostalgic people from who miss the good old times. And now it's all very zen and very polished and very business-like, and they make, I don't know what it's like now post-pandemic, but pre-pandemic they were making big bucks, and they had lots of volunteers working for them as usual, because then they can still have their experience of being there. Lots of Indians as well who pay less, and then they have special rules. They can't participate in some of the more sexual courses or so. So it's a bit of they've been accused of racism, the OIMR. So it was all fascinating. It was like a little cultiverse there in Pune. And then on one day we just had enough, and we just got on a motorbike and we drove to a tattoo festival somewhere in the outside of town, and we felt like escapees. It was amazing. There was rock music, and it just felt real and alive, and not so sterile and so weird and so conformist. And so that also to have the contrast of a loud, noisy Indian city, and then you're in this serene environment, which in itself it can be wonderful, a serene environment, but not when it feels so controlling. And the whole history also of what it stands for, and no one there was happy to talk about that. They told me, no one wants to talk about that, what went down all these years ago. Only you with your dirty mind. That's what they literally told me.
That was the really interesting interaction between you and the head honcho, where you would press him and ask those difficult questions, but these things did happen. Oh, you're a journalist, so only you think that. And I'm like, how do you know that that she's the only one that thinks that. Like, and then he would say, you need to move on. Everyone else has. And again, it was that thought terminating cliche language that he was using. Like,
Yep.
if you have a problem with this, it's only you that has a problem with it. Nobody else does. Everybody else
Yes.
understands that that's all in the past. Very similar language to the apologists of Centrepoint, to those that were complicit in what happened there. And I just thought it was really interesting, because then you said, well, how come the only books you can buy from the bookshop are those written by Osho? And oh yeah, you're asking all the wrong questions. Just, it was really, really interesting part of the book, because he does have defenders around the world. And I always say that people need to stop quoting Osho, because he was never an enlightened being that had a closer connection to divinity than anybody else.
And we now know that he was a sexual abuser. As of last year, a woman has come forward. I mean, all power to her. She finally spoke up, and it's on the record. I mean, we've heard it from one of his victims. So he was a serious sexual abuser, yeah, and he had a hit list. I mean, that again has changed. I mean, not that there was much to change, because I already, didn't think highly of him and never got the fascination. But that in itself is just a really big piece that I think they need to acknowledge. And until then, they're sexual abuse enablers and deniers and apologists. Oh, and the last little fun fact from my stay at the resort was that I got very sick from Sufi whirling and collapsed in the grass. Too much Sufi whirling, it's not good for the stomach, I can tell you. Yeah.
Think that is that the part where Frank says he's had a great time and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing very well?
He was enjoying himself a lot more. Maybe he was just more open-minded, whereas I was always critical. It's like, why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? That's ridiculous. Oh, and I always tried to swim in the pool, but you had to pay extra to swim in the pool, and it became a little challenge every day that I could just sneak off, go into the pool. And once they called me, I get out of here straight away. And I thought they would actually frog march me to the changing rooms. It's that kind of environment. No, it didn't feel like a former sex cult. There was nothing sexy about it, nothing cozy and cuddly and sensual. It was all very, militaristic in some ways. Almost. I mean, at least for me. I've got to be careful here. Don't want them to sue me. I'm sure they're pretty litigious and they might be listening. So for me, it felt like that. I'm not saying this is what it is, okay? You're right.
And ironically, the conformity and the militaristic aspect of what now happens in the ashram compared to what used to happen in the other ashram is quite a contrast. And I imagine outwardly, Rajneesh always said, this is not how we live, even though, of course, intrinsically attempting to also establish a system of totalist authoritarianism, whilst preaching that that's not what we do here.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are not happy, even here around me in Christchurch, who still adore Osho, and they were not happy because they think I'm making a mockery out of it all. And yeah, I mean, to be fair, I only went there for a week, and I only went to what is now this resort, which some of the old guard who are not happy with what's happening in that, Cashram or Club Med now, they can always, and they do say to me, well, you weren't there in the old days. This is all different. We were all, we're having the best time of our lives, and we were listening to Osho, and it was so amazing. It was this big communal experience and the group awakening. And of course, you wouldn't find that if you just go there for a week now and this on a spiritual holiday, with a lot of cynicism and your dirty journalistic mind on. And that again is such a cop out, because yes, of course, what I experienced that week doesn't prove anything, but the knowledge is there. I mean, we know what happened, and there are enough people now speaking up about it. And just because I'm shining a little light on my my week there, and what you rightly, you're absolutely right. One of the people there being such a cult apologist is actually very, very telling for the whole organization, I think. But it's really hard. It was always hard for me throughout the whole book, with people who are opposed to what I do, that they could always say, you haven't been there, but you weren't there. You weren't one of us. You haven't come out of the cult. Yeah, they can't really shut the survivors down because they cannot go to someone like Louise, the girl in the caravan, and say this didn't happen to you. They can just pretend they didn't know, or maybe it wasn't that bad, or there's another side to the story or so. But with me, they can always say, "You weren't there. You don't know. What do you know?" Right? So I'm always up against that, but I own that. I have spoken to enough people, and there's enough information out there, and it's also accessible to the deniers. They could have the same level of knowledge I've gained.
As you've mentioned, there's various different factions and chapters of the falling out of the Rajneesh movement, with individuals being accused of being close followers of Rajneesh and now operating human trafficking circles and being responsible for the sexual exploitation of women, moving them to different countries. We've had individuals come and do interviews on the podcast where they've spoken about being victims of individuals that practiced under Rajneesh, took so many of the tactics and methods used by Rajneesh during the peak of the Rajneesh movement and now apply it to their own circles of manipulation and coercion. And so even though this clinical ashram exists where people can go and there aren't really that many outward signs that those abuses took place and that those environments existed, it is still felt around the world. And it's like an insidious thing that just grows under the surface of marble floors and people denying that bad things ever happened.
And what I've always felt over the years, and it's maybe it has been difficult for me to identify where it comes from, but I think it is partly maybe human potential movement stuff, and it's also the Osho, or the Bhagwan movement philosophy, whatever you want to call it. It's this whole notion of it's always your stuff, the lack of empathy, the lack of ownership. There is always an expectation that if you suffer, if you're not happy, if something happened to you, it's only for you and only for you to sort out, not for the person who you're in conflict with. So I've seen this as center point, and I've felt this always very much also with sannyasins I met across the world, especially in Germany back then, who had, they didn't have a charitable bone in their body. They were finding themselves in India and traveling wherever they're in the world, but they did not believe in doing any charitable work, or they were definitely not social justice warriors. And at the time I was much more a social justice person than a spiritual person. So that always baffled me, that they're all after their enlightenment and whatnot, but they had this, this fatalistic, is that even the right word, but this view of, well, these people, who are suffering, we can't help them anyway. We're not here to, I've heard this again and again. Also at my week when I was there at the meditation resort, where they said, well, we're not here to rescue them. We're not here to change, how screwed up the Indian society is or whatever, we're not here to rescue them. Like that's their work to do. We do our work, we do theirs. And I mean, to some degree, I get what they mean. On the other hand, I think there's such a coldness and such a lack of empathy in it. And I see this, it's rife in the New Age world. It's all about, I got mineism. If this works for me, then it's great. And if it doesn't work for you and you've had a bad experience, well, then sorry, but it's not for me to judge what happened. Yeah, I think it's actually part of the wider problem that I now feel very passionate about, namely, calling out sexual abuse in these New Age and Tantra spaces. And I think it's these kind of this kind of thinking, and I mean, I don't know exactly where we can pinpoint it to where it comes from, but it's definitely been perpetuated a lot through the whole sannyasin world. And we see what the kind of spiritual bypassing and denial and gaslighting it creates now.
And that was still a present factor in the next part, where you find yourself in Thailand. So again, if you would please, Anke, just talk the listeners through the kind of the third, or the third quarter of
the middle
the
part,
book.
the middle part. Yeah. It's called Toxic Tantra. And yeah, after visiting the Osho ashram, again, it kind of fell into my lap because I was already following a cult journalist who you might probably know, B. Schofield in the United States, bit of a gonzo journalist who really goes, a cult buster and a journalist. I have a lot of respect for her. And she published a report that fallen into her hands, or that people had handed to her, 31 women of a yoga school in Thailand, which I'd never heard about until then, had complained about or had reported about their sexual abuse. It's actually not quite true. I did hear, I only put the dots together later, but I did come across someone, quite a sort of cocky Tantra teacher guy. I actually did a session with him once, and he said, oh yeah, he said to me, oh, I lived in a Tantra community in Thailand for 3 years and it was amazing. And it's always stuck with me. I thought, oh, Tantric community in Thailand, well, that sounds fascinating. And then only later I put the dots together and thought, oh, he was actually an Agama. So Agama is this, and it's actually still going in Koh Phangan, little hippie island, or Vice recently called it Tantra Island in Thailand. Beautiful, beautiful place. And Agama absolutely dominated the Tantra and yoga scene there. So it called itself a yoga university, but also a Tantric school. And the backdrop to Agama, and this is fascinating and also absolutely disturbing, is an esoteric yoga school from Romania called Misa. And they have a guru who's actually one of the most on the wanted list from Interpol, and they have a shocking track record of sex trafficking, of alleged sex trafficking, pushing women into porn and pole dancing and sex work to become quote unquote goddesses, with a lot of quote unquote karma yoga. Absolutely insidious, horrific organization that is still going under the umbrella of the Atman Federation, Tara Yoga in the UK, for instance, right? So you wouldn't make the connection straight away because it's just a yoga school, or Nata Yoga in Scandinavia. And Agama, their guru, or Swami as he calls himself, is actually Narcis Takau from Romania, who left Misa at some point and then started his own outfit there. And probably chose wisely to go to Thailand because the statute of limitation for rape at the time was only 3 months. And it's very possible that he's been bribing the authorities so he could run things his way on the island. And they were definitely one of the biggest players there on Koh Phangan, and they have a lot of yoga schools there. So in 2018, these reports were published because students within Agama had, like in so many cults, had again and again over the years tried to change the system from within, to bring allegations to the head of the school, to create change. They didn't want to burn the whole palace down, but they wanted enough of a revolution. They wanted enough of a revolution so that things would change. And it never happened because they had this megalomaniac as a leader. So when everything blew up and B. Schofield published a report, he flew from the island and was gone for 3 months. In that time, I flew there, and together with the Guardian, it was me and the Guardian, and they didn't go there, but they reported about it. We basically blew this out of the water for the mainstream media, me for Germany and New Zealand, and the Guardian obviously for the UK and the rest of the world. And it was a massive Me Too scandal that rocked the yoga and Tantra world. There had been reports before, but they were never really in big media outlets. It was more like B. Schofield or websites or Facebook groups like Tantra Not Trauma. And also because this was a yoga school, so it wasn't just a neo Tantra outfit. They had a hardcore training. People they did their yoga training there. This was their professional education that they did. Yeah. And to then maybe become a yoga teacher somewhere else when they go back. Most of the students were all from around the world, international students, the States, UK, Australia, some Kiwis, from some New Zealanders who I've interviewed. And so much coercion, so much sort of pickup artistry, almost pushing men into becoming these dominant figures, women who have to surrender to really then, oh God, where do I even begin? I could go and, I could do a whole rant about the misogynistic stereotypes in this kind of Tantra that's maybe even culturally appropriated from its origins. And it basically led to rape. to women being raped in these yoni massages, or going for a meditation, being invited for meditation in the guru's home always meant that he's going to have sex with you. And women were supposed to be grateful for that, because he was, sharing his magic cup with them and healing them. And it was just so, it's just terrible what happened there. And at the same time, even though there were no children involved, but people had invested a lot. They couldn't just leave. Maybe their passports weren't locked up in a safe, but they didn't have a work visa. And if they would go into the police and complain, they would actually run into trouble for having worked at the school, or they had built their whole existence there, becoming yoga teachers themselves and running courses. So again, their lives, their identities, their friendships, their whole community was tied to Agama, and then everything fell over. So that was a massive scandal. And I went there, and it gave me so much more insight also into how these things play out in a bit of a different environment, but also the similarities, and then also the closeness to the group that I was involved with at the time, namely ISTA, International School of Temple Arts. And after I came back from my Agama research, I had a stopover in England where I did my very last training ever with ISTA. I was actually an assistant, and I went to the two lead teachers, to women who I really liked and respected at the time. And I said, hey, hey, can I just, I'm like the harbinger here. I have something to tell you. I've just been investigating Agama yoga, and I think you need to be aware of how, ISTA is going to be the same. You're going to end up in the same way as an abusive sex cult if you don't change a few things here. And they were not interested in hearing more from me. They're basically, that's not what I was. That was not my role. I was there to fill the water bottles and make sure, people that I was leading in the morning would all, no one would quit. Actually, one woman did quit, so I probably didn't do a good enough job as an assistant. But that was my personal turning point as well. I thought, I can't really support this whole world anymore. They don't see their own, blind spots and shadows, and there's too much arrogance, and they're a few degrees better than Agama, but they have it's basically the same problems, even if it's not, it wasn't rape at that stage, but there were definitely transgressions. And now we also know that there has been rape. And I just published a story in Germany with the exclusive news that a rabbi from ISTA has actually had a rape complaint filed with him against him in Israel. So, it's all very intertwined. What I was personally still exploring at the time, and the research I was doing was getting very close. And I definitely now then had skin in the game, because this wasn't just a historic sex cult, but a school that's going. And I actually know and knew people from ISTA who had been through Agama. So it's very close to home in some ways.
Feels very urgent as well. It's like, okay, the leader's gone, we need to get in, we're going to collect these stories, we know there's an expose, and then we're going to break everything wide open before he gets back.
Well, no, the sad news is that all these media stories didn't lead to Agama actually closing down. They could get away with it. They just rebranded for a little bit. They sent out a newsletter where they're basically blaming the victims and pretending these are all lies, and they got away with it because people either forget, or they don't Google, or they just want to have their amazing weekend Kopangan with a yoga school where maybe the first class is free, and they get hooked in, and they don't. The cognitive, honestly, it just baffles me that after everything we now know about Agama, after media reports in, I think, over 50 countries, 2 or 3 documentaries where they were exposed and named and shamed, people still go there. I mean, it's a much, much smaller school now. Things have definitely changed, but I think during COVID, apparently, I haven't been there since, but some of my sources, they told me things have really ramped up again because they did so much online training. And they've never had a proper, then you go on their website, you don't even read anything like a PR statement that says something about, well, we made some mistakes in 2018 and we're sorry, blah, blah, nothing, as if it's never happened. Unbelievable.
I feel like that's almost a pattern with a lot of tantric yoga groups that are led by swamis, that masses and masses of allegations come out, lawsuits take place, people are sued, people serve jail time, and yet these places never stop existing. Yogaville, 3HO, Kundalini Yoga, um, Agami. I mean, the ashram in India that people go and visit because of the, air quotes, good old days. And Mary Garden talked about going to visit a very isolated ashram, a tiny little place near the rainforest where she stayed and was horrifically treated. And
Yes.
this
Yeah.
place still exists, and this man is still doing what he was doing years before, and it's always the same playbook. It's always the same. I'm a celibate enlightened leader. We're not having sex. I'm just raising your kundalini levels. um and you're the only person that I do this with, as well as all the other girls that are here, and so on and so forth. And now we are understanding that Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was not excluded from those same tactics as well. He and even kind of even more nefarious was saying that the only way he is enlightened is because he draws from female energy. So he needs to keep himself surrounded by women to remain enlightened so that he can pass this special enlightenment down onto other people. So basically, like, if the women don't stay close to me, I'm not enlightened, and therefore you never will be either. Like, there's such a twisted and dark thing. Um, but
Yeah.
you've at this point researched and investigated Centerpoint, which was heavily, which as separate as an intentional community, was heavily focused on radical sex and psychedelic drug taking
Yeah.
and therapy. And
Yeah.
then we're talking about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, which is a whole other thing on its own, but kind of still links to yogic practices,
And
um,
Tantra.
and
Yeah.
and tantra. And then you're spending time on a remote island in Thailand, but that is different because it's still ongoing, and the leader is active and present. And the last part of the book is about Christian fundamentalism, which is very different from these first three things, and is back in New Zealand. So you've kind of gone full circle at this point, but to just a different part of the country of New Zealand, and is still, like the small island in Thailand, a very much present and ongoing and existing community. So I wondered if you could just talk the listener, because we've never covered Gloria Vale on the podcast. So for anyone listening that isn't sure, can you please explain to the listeners, what is Gloria Vale?
Oh, and please do an episode just about Gloria Vale. I'd love to put you in touch with some good people, because it's a big topic in New Zealand. It has been for a while. I mean, they've been here since they've existed for decades. I mean, wow, almost. Gosh, when did they start? Around the same time as Centerpoint, actually. In fact, the charismatic leader of Gloriaville and the charismatic leader of Centerpoint, they saw each other as rivals to some degree. So founded by a traveling preacher from Australia, fundamentalist Christians, wanted to, live without possessions, like, in the early Bible sort of. Look, I'm not super firm in the whole Christian ideology around it, but it's fundamentalist, share all possessions, everyone is dressed the same, so they didn't get into these uniforms, the blue uniforms, straight away, but they have been for a long time, since they moved onto this compound called Gloriaville that's in the bush in the west coast New Zealand, quite remote even for New Zealand standards. And New Zealand has been fascinated with them because we had a glossy TV program in 2016, 17. And so New Zealanders have a bit of a weird obsession with Gloriaville. And whenever they hear that I've actually gone in there twice, they go, oh, tell me about Gloriaville. So they see this as this fascinating, sort of sugar-coated, freak show in some ways. They do not, or they haven't until recently, I think, really understood that it's actually a gulag with massive human rights violations, and especially subjugation of women. So big families, but if you think of some Mormon cults, lots and lots of children, no birth control, you marry as soon as you can, you're being married off, you have no choice in who you get married to. Everyone, all the families with their kids sleep in one room, no privacy. And similar to Centerpoint, even though it's not promiscuity is the dogma, but it's also very much a dogma around being sexually available as a wife for your husband. It's actually in their scriptures. It's actually in their little booklet, what we believe. It's right there from the get-go. And like you said, even though this was, you're right. This was almost like I wouldn't say an outlier for me, but it was at first just a purely journalistic project. When I went there for the first time, I was actually sent there by various media outlets. I did a big investigation for New Zealand Geographic, where I met lots of people who've left and sort of traced back their recovery and how they've been. But I also once went for another media outlet and sat through their excruciatingly long and fascinating and somehow disturbing Disney-like concert, which they put on every 2 years for free to keep their charitable status. And I wrote a sort of scathing review about it, or just to say, hey, this is not a freak show. People are actually suffering in here. What are we doing going to their concerts and pretending it's just all fun? Bread and circus. So I had, I've written stories about them, but it only actually got really under my skin at my last round, when I was wrapping, Glorivell up for my book and was updating a few interviews, and then met an amazing woman. Her name is Virginia Courage, who had only come out 2 years earlier. She'd been born in Centerpoint, and she and her husband and children all came out, and it's almost like it was going down the rabbit hole into Gilead, the Handmaid's Tale. It's what it felt like. Which always, when I watched The Handmaid's Tale, Glorivell's always come to my mind, the similarities of the women being breeding machines, being basically so much under the control, not just of their husbands so much, but of the leaders and shepherds, who are basically like the parents or the husbands above the husbands, who have ultimate control. Just the brutality, the subjugation, also of the men, so much trauma. The children, who are also very sexualized, because it's so much sort of in their face. A lot of boys on boys, teenage abuse, where older boys force younger boys, and then they later become perpetrators as well. So it's like a massive incest family in lots of ways. And shockingly, these issues have stayed under the radar for so long. You think with Centerpoint in New Zealand, which is actually, even on the global scale, given we're just a little peaceful little country at the bottom of the world, not really renowned for our crazy sex cults, right? Centerpoint was a massive scandal and lawsuits, and a massive shock, a scar on the psyche of the social history of New Zealand. And you would think we would have learned more from that, but no. Here we are, 20 years later, and now Glorivell is in the courts for all sorts of offenses: sexual abuse, slave labor, all sorts of violation, you name it, because there's an amazing volunteer organization that sprung up a few years ago called the Glorivell Leavers Support Trust. And they are actually Christians from a Baptist church further sort of 4 hours down the road on the other side of the South Island, New Zealand, and they're helping them. And they've actually built a really great cult-informed organization that helps with the transition work, helps leavers who come out, because families come out sometimes in the middle of the night, and they are like refugees from another country. They really do not know how the world out here works. Yes, they speak the same language. Yes, they might have the similar skin color, and they can go to the op shop and buy new clothes. But apart from that, they really do not know how to fit in, and they go through so much trauma, and there had actually been nothing for them for so many years. So so only when I met Virginia Courage, I think something really landed for me emotionally, because I'm a mother myself. I've given birth, and to hear from her that telling me that one of the women she knows, a friend of hers, was basically expected to be sexually available for her husband hours after giving birth. And I mean, we're talking, women who've already given, given birth to children like 10 times, and their bodies are wrecked. There is so much suicidal ideation there. There is depression that all goes untreated because, of course, mental health problems are seen as a lack of faith. So you would never, get to see a therapist or a mental health worker or so. So it was a game changer for me, actually. And then the overall, the arch, the link, you could think at first, oh, what are these three random cults doing in one book? The former sex cult and the Tantra yoga cult, they're in Thailand on the island, and now the Christian fundamentalists on the West Coast in New Zealand. But what really binds them all together is that they are sex cults. If we even want to use that term, I think more correctly, sex abuse cults, because of their over-sexualized culture, even though they all looked very different in these different places, right? Each cult sort of had their own dogma, what it should look like. But as you probably know, sexuality is one of these things that's always controlled in cults. Maybe not in MLMs. I don't really know much about how that plays out. But apart from multi-level marketing, every cult has, in some way, shape, or form, either suppresses or amplifies or distorts their member sexualities. And that's definitely the case in Gloriaville as well. And so I've been trying to highlight that and say, hey, it's not just, that cult that puts on these concerts and they wear these blue frocks and they all look weird and we think they're cute and they have these funny names. And no, this is, this is a serious, this is a serious human rights problem. This is a feminist issue. It's a humanitarian issue.
I think a link is also the subjugation of women and children. And I don't know if it's because I am a woman that when it's present in a destructive group, I really see it more than perhaps other elements and moving parts of certain groups. But you can see a pattern of the subjugation of women under the guise of pushing therapy boundaries or personal development or for your relationship to God, whatever the justification is for women to be abused and subjugated by those in positions of power. You can't not see the similarities. And I always say that it doesn't matter what the group's rhetoric is, what the group's beliefs or teachings are. If you were to just take the identifying markers of all of these groups and list them on a piece of paper, we could probably sit here all day between the two of us, Anke, and go, oh, maybe it's Scientology. Oh, actually, maybe it's the Jehovah's Witnesses. And you go around and around and around. And of course, I understand that that's how frameworks are able to exist by the leading cult experts in the world. If we didn't have these earmarks and similarities between destructive groups, we wouldn't have these frameworks that survivors can apply to their experiences and say, oh my goodness, wow, I was in a cult. But it's almost laughable when some groups say, oh, well, we're not like them because we believe in God, or, oh, well, we're not like them because we're anti-religion, but we're pro-therapy.
It's never about the content, right? It doesn't actually matter. You could do the most, the craziest stuff. And I've been through some courses where I do some pretty extreme stuff. It's not about how extreme something is, even though, if you already do some pretty mind-bending things, it probably is then also easier to be manipulated and believe in, that your leader is God and whatnot. But it's actually not about the teachings. I mean, one example, for instance, I've done some great silent meditation retreats, right? And then I've also heard about some where they're very dogmatic and they tell you not to take your drugs if you're bipolar, and people go into psychosis, and they, only show you the video of this one guru every night that you listen to. So even with something as innocuous as meditation can become very controlling and break people down in a certain way. But it's not because meditation itself is dangerous. I mean, at least the Agama yoga was not problematic because they did yoga. Then again, of course, you could also argue, but the yoga culture in itself and the guru culture and so on, how much of that also supports a certain thinking that then makes you hand your own power over, and you don't question the leader, and you don't speak up because you don't want to attract, be seen as a negative person. So sure, certain philosophies and religions, I mean, I would say it's probably across the board that in most, I mean, all the religious cults I've come across, or I've heard about, or I've researched, there's always the line of, it's that you're a better person if you can forgive, the perpetrator, or that your spiritual growth is bigger if you don't, speak up. There's always that spiritual bypassing element that some are better for you or for the world or for your, you show more faith if you're not a victim, if you don't have a problem. So it's kind of baked in the philosophy as well, but it's not about the content, right? It's always about the power structures and the dynamics and who's at top and, the groupthink and all of that.
Well, I absolutely loved reading Cult Trip. There are parts that are difficult and dark. There are parts that are funny and uplifting. I particularly liked reading about you and Frank going on your travels together. That was really nice. And there are also parts that allow us to see the direct links between destructive groups throughout different stages of history and also different parts of the world, cultures and contexts and influences, but also really at the end of it, all looking exactly the same. I feel so connected to your work through my own personal experiences of interviewing survivors. I feel as though it's similar. I've just never visited these places in person. And I wonder if you have any plans going forward to look into any more groups, or if you get open invitations or requests to do certain things, or if you just hear little stories and nuggets of things where you think, that's something that I am interested in looking into.
To be honest, I am not doing any more cult investigations. Definitely not for now. I feel I've done enough. It's incredibly hard, especially as a freelancer, to get these things over the line. It takes so much energy, and legally you're on thin ice. And I feel I've put everything in the book, but at the same time, I'm doing a lot of stuff in the background. So I probably get emails on a weekly basis of people who want to talk to me about a cult experience, or they have questions. So I'm a big networker. So I started a Facebook group called Culty Conversations NZ. It's not just for New Zealanders, but it's sort of the beginning of, it's a platform for people to bring things to light and talk about them, and just to raise cult awareness. I'm also connected with activists around the world, with other journalists. So I'm often liaised between activists, survivors, and media outlets who are keen to run a story. And I think, okay, let them do it. I know the story. I know what the story is. I'm enough of a journalist to see what the story is. And I know the content. I get what the sort of juice of the story is, but I don't necessarily need to write it all and research it all and get it legalized and then deal with the backlash. Let someone else do that. So I pass that on. And I've started running workshops. They're called How Not to Start a Cult. So, and I'm actually taking them around the world as well. One to Thailand, Koh Phangan. I'm going to Byron Bay this year as well. And I've just done these workshops here at some summer festivals, some hippie festivals in New Zealand and here in Christchurch. And basically, educating people about what are the red flags. What makes a cult? How do we spot these things? How can we nip them in the bud? And especially speaking to people who are facilitators or participants in self-development and yoga workshops and tantra workshops. So really, not just people who want to hear horrific things about cults, because they often forget cults, we always speak about the sinister cults. Well, they don't feel sinister when you first step into them. They always feel great. They always feel good, right? They always look amazing and you learn amazing things. And so just to bust these myths also of what makes typical cult followers. So that's a bit of my, these are my key messages that I try to put out wherever I can. So I'm doing more of this sort of organization building, platform building, media liaison work, and I love it. I think, I want to use the momentum that I've created with the book and just take it a little bit further. And of course, I'll be at some point, I'm sure I will be writing about cults again, but not really don't want to go near anything again as much as I did for the book. I think I've done my hard yards. Yeah.
you have any plans to bring How Not to Start a Cult over to the UK?
Just invite me and I come.
That would be awesome, because I listened to your chat with Stephen Mather from Cult Hackers, and he's over here. And there's quite a few of us content creators that would absolutely love the chance to go to a workshop titled How Not to Start a Cult. And it
Oh, I mean, it's a little bit tongue in cheek. It's actually a serious topic, but we promoted a little bit tongue in cheek, where I said, "Do you suffer from too much charisma? Are you worried that you're too fond of your tribe? Well, fear not, we've got you covered. Don't be a follower, don't be a guru." But yeah, so that the jokes around the cults, which are out there in the public sphere, that through that I can actually get people to see the deeper, more important side of it, which is actually important for everything. It's not just about cults. It's actually more learning about these coercive dynamics and how they appear, and that people in cults are no different from people anywhere else. And in fact, I think they're often really great people. Personally, I really believe it's some of the best human qualities that bring people into cults. So I'm always find I have a lot of respect, especially for those who've come out and can work through it all. So I'd be happy to be part of something. Yeah. Next year, 2024 in the UK. Let's make
2024.
it
I would
happen.
love that. We will make it happen. Who knows?
Yes.
Maybe Ixa will be back over here in the UK as well for because it's got to come back around to the UK at some point. The last time you were all here in Manchester, I hadn't even started this podcast and didn't know anything about cults. So I have to believe that one day everyone will come back over to the UK. I was looking at the lineup for this year's conference, and 80% of people speaking have been on the podcast. So it would be so amazing for me to be there in person and be like, oh my goodness, all these people here in person, networking, learning about cults, and just spreading that education and
Oh,
that
you could
prevention.
do a live episode from the conference. Wouldn't that be amazing? You could just go around with a microphone and capture it all. And
Oh, that would be so good. Here comes the journalist in you, like, oh yeah,
of course.
you need to turn that into an opportunity. And my brain is always doing the same thing. So that kind of rounds up our conversation today. I wondered if you could just let everybody know where they can find copies of your amazing book, Cult Trip, that has the best cover art, that also reminds me of The Handmaid's Tale. When you look at it, I get those vibes.
It's amazing that you say Handmaid's Tale, because it's for New Zealanders, it says glory about, but since you don't know the costumes, that's actually perfect, because the overall optic looks like the cover, Handmaid's Tale, clever. It's actually, I think she's award-winning designer, that one who designed it for HarperCollins. So if you can't find the book in your good local bookshop, which would always be my first suggestion, support your local bookshop or your library, it's fine, of course, any, Amazon, it's on Kindle, it's Mighty Ape, wherever you buy your books. Unfortunately, Book Depository has closed down, but yeah, it's a book that's widely available. I saw people, friends in London sent me photos that it's, from the big bookshops there in Soho and Piccadilly Square, and it was there on the shelf. So you should be able to find it. Cult Trip. Yeah, go and find your Cult Trip.
Awesome. That's so good. And I am so thankful that I got a copy, and I've added it to my growing collection of some of the best books in the world, written by some of the best people that then come to chat with me, which makes it even better. So thank you so much for your time today, Anke. Thank you for writing such an incredible book, for sharing it with the world, despite almost writing a book and then not writing it, and then kind of writing it and allowing us to see what went into that process. It's been amazing to be part of the post launch story of Cult Trip, and I'm really looking forward to bringing this conversation to the listeners. So thank you so much, and I hope that you go and get a really good night's sleep.
Yeah, it's getting late here. I wanted to thank you not just for reading it and for having me on the show, but also for understanding it so well. I think I have not yet done an interview with someone who, you know, who had such detailed questions. I really felt you went into all the nooks and crannies, and it's actually amazing getting feedback from people who understand the cultiverse, not just, you know, your average reader, but because I was always a bit worried that the ones who are the experts, which I'm not, that, you know, this wouldn't be their kind of book. So it really means a lot. Thank you, Casey. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for having me here.
Take care. Bye, bye, bye.